A long-haired girl in a voluminous white dress pensively sorts through white roses. Her eyes are cast downward. It seems she is saddened by something. What is this young beauty thinking about? Nothing, historians say. After all, she is dead. Posthumous photo shoots were a common practice in Victorian England. When a loved one passed away, the family would invite a photographer because ordering a painted portrait was quite expensive, and only wealthy families could afford it. With the advent of photography, such a procedure became more accessible, and when the family invited a photographer, the photos were taken together with the deceased to make them look realistic. They could even be seated or posed in some way. For this, photographers used various props, chairs, clamps, and other devices to hold the head or hands, for example, and indeed, the deceased looked as if they were alive. The services of English photographers of that time can be described by the main marketing principle: any whim for your money. Deceased children were photographed as if they were engaged in some game, and the elderly were photographed in bed, as if they had lain down to rest. Today, these photos seem eerie, but experts say, what could the British do if death was an integral part of life back then, and not in a philosophical sense? Epidemics repeatedly decimated entire cities, and every Englishman lived by the principle of memento mori, not knowing if they would wake up in the morning. This was primarily linked to economic development, because industrialization and the construction of numerous factories led to phenomena such as unemployment and the emergence of a large number of poor people. Naturally, the poor lived with many people in one house, several families crowded into one room, and of course, living conditions were far from hygienic and mortality was very high. Therefore, people prepared for death in advance, perceiving it as something natural, and hence, this cult of death truly became a norm of life during this period. Eventually, a special genre emerged in the art of photography, post-mortem, that is, portraits of the deceased, and its founder is considered to be the British Queen Victoria herself, in whose honor the historical milestone of England from 1837 to 1901 was named. According to the recollections of courtiers, the ruler was literally obsessed with her deceased spouse. Prince Consort Albert died of typhoid fever in his wife's arms. The Queen hung a photograph of her husband on his deathbed above her bed and plunged into deep mourning. She did not leave the walls of Windsor Castle for a long time. She even ordered that his clothes and personal items be laid out in his room every day. Busts of him were placed throughout the palace, and they were decorated with fresh flowers. So this can be called an obsession. Ladies-in-waiting noticed that even Queen Victoria's face seemed to change and began to resemble a wax mask. At formal events, she could not even manage a half smile, and until the end of her days, she wore only black dresses, unintentionally setting a fashion trend for this color. Soon, it became associated with something aristocratic, and the nobility ordered suits from tailors exclusively in black. Writers of that time wrote, all of England, following the Queen, seemed to be enveloped in terrible grief. When the writer Walter Scott was asked, why do you never write about your contemporaries? Do you know what he said about these bourgeoisie and bankers? He said, about a contemporary, I can write only 2 lines, the date of birth and the date of death on his tombstone. And the entire Victorian era was as if permeated by this principle. Queen Victoria's mourning seemed to impose an obligation on all female residents of Great Britain to grieve just as deeply for their deceased spouses. In high society, booklets even appeared detailing how and how long to mourn properly. In general, in Victorian England, it was customary to mourn for 2.5 years for a spouse. But if the wife loved him very, very much, she could extend her mourning by another 2 years, the so-called half-mourning. For a close relative, mourning usually lasted a year, and if it was a distant relative, then 6 months or less. If it was mourning for a distant relative, how was it usually shown? For example, instead of constantly wearing black gloves, 3 stripes in the form of threads were embroidered on white gloves to indicate mourning for a distant relative. As for the mourning dress, it was supposed to be made only of bombazine with crepe trim. These are very dense, matte fabrics, and the choice of fashionistas was not accidental. After all, on such outfits, even the slightest traces of tears were clearly visible. the widow was required to express sorrow. Fortunately, the face could be hidden behind a heavy veil, but this accessory could drive the owner herself into the grave. Fabrics were previously dyed using chemicals that contained arsenic and a host of other elements. Therefore, it was difficult for a woman to breathe under this veil. The dye could flake off and get on the skin, causing various allergic reactions and breathing difficulties. Often, the widow herself would soon die after the death of her spouse, for example. Therefore, the veil was dangerous for women. When it became clear how dangerous widows' veils were, designers had to come up with a replacement for mourning accessories. After all, women were strictly forbidden to wear ordinary jewelry, such as diamonds. This was considered a terrible disrespect to the deceased. The main stone of mourning was jet, also known as black amber. It was polished to a matte finish, and it was officially allowed to be worn during mourning in 1830 when George IV died, and the only jewelry allowed was black jet. Any other stones or anything that sparkled was forbidden, and from then on, throughout the 19th century, only black jet was combined with mourning. This rule was even enshrined in the House of Lords. British parliamentarians developed official requirements for aristocratic mourning attire. In Victorian England, designers became bolder and proposed a new trend: jewelry made from the hair and teeth of the deceased. The Queen set the fashion once again. When Queen Victoria's daughter, Princess Victoria, finally lost her first baby tooth, she was so upset that she did not want to throw it away but asked to have it set in gold and made into the famous thistle brooch, where, it turns out, the tooth replaced the flower. And other mothers also began to keep these baby teeth. And if a child died, this tooth became part of the mourning jewelry, like a pendant. Mourning costumes and jewelry became family heirlooms. They were passed down through generations and carefully preserved. And if for the British nobility, a well-tailored mourning outfit was an expensive pleasure, what about the poor? They had to rent funeral clothes to maintain decency. Over time, mourning fashion began to fade into the past. With the end of the Victorian era, mourning was no longer considered such an element of an ordinary person's life. And economically, it was unprofitable because mourning outfits were expensive. Fashion historians regretfully say, very few mourning dresses from the time of Queen Victoria have survived. Therefore, British mourning fashion is studied mainly through the descriptions of publicists and the rare outfits that representatives of the English aristocracy have preserved. Widows' costumes are characterized by their conciseness, strict cut, and lack of details like embroidery or unusual trimmings. Therefore, it is possible that Coco Chanel took them as the basis when she created her legendary little black dress, which made her famous worldwide.